My name is Benedikt Bunz. I'm a PhD student here at Stanford, and I'm going to talk about bullet proofs, which are short proofs for confidential transaction, and a lot more, actually. And this is joint work with Jonathan Boodle from the University College London, my advisor Dan Benedikt, and Andrew, Peter, and Greg, or Andrew and Peter from Blockstream and Greg Maxwell. So this is a talk about, so if you might have seen this is kind of a depiction of what a Bitcoin transaction looks like, but the same thing applies to other cryptocurrencies very similarly. And the important thing to note is that there's some sort of inputs on the left that come into the transaction and some sort of outputs that go out of the transaction. And it is important that the inputs are greater or equal to the outputs, or the outputs are less than the inputs. And actually the difference between the outputs and inputs is exactly the fee that is sort of paid to the miners for verifying the transactions. This is all you need to understand about Bitcoin and blockchain. You don't, this is just some generic transaction format. So when is a Bitcoin transaction valid? Well, there's three criterion really. One of them is that the signature is correct, so that there's some person who owns the inputs, authorizes that the transaction is being spent. The second one is that the inputs are unspent, so you cannot spend money twice. And then the third one is the one that we're going to care most about today, which is that the sum of the inputs is equal to the sum of the outputs plus the fees. So one problem with Bitcoin transactions and many other cryptocurrency transactions is that they're not confidential, or they don't have any privacy, so they're neither what we call confidential or anonymous. And by confidentiality, I mean that the amounts are hidden, and by anonymity, I mean that you can see who is paying whom. And you can see these addresses, they hide, like it doesn't say that who's paying whom in terms of real world identities, but it actually turns out that it's quite easy to figure out who owns which address, and then you can clearly see how much money is being transferred. It's publicly available on the blockchain, and you can see who is paying whom. So why is this a problem? Well, this has many implications for businesses, especially the transaction amounts being available in the clear. And for example, it means that if you receive your salary in Bitcoin or some other similar cryptocurrency, it is that your salary will be public, and everybody can just look up what your salary is. And also, if you're a business and you're buying some sort of tools from your supplier, say, Ford buys tires from Michelin or whatever, and then everybody can publicly see how much is being paid for these goods. And these are important business secrets that business would want to hide. So this really makes blockchains, in some ways at least, less usable for businesses. So to combat this, there's this idea of confidential transactions, which Greg Maxwell came up in 2016. And the idea is that instead of sending the amounts in the clear, we encrypt them, or more correctly, we use a cryptographic commitment, which is kind of like saying we put the amounts in an envelope. A cryptographic commitment is something that does not reveal the value, but after the fact, I can only open it to be the value that I originally committed to. So just like an envelope. And then, so concretely, we would use these Pedersen commitments, which are discrete log-based. So the problem now, obviously, if no one, or if it's publicly not visible what the amounts are, how can we check that the transaction is valid? And especially, how can we check that third constraint, that the sum of inputs is greater or equal to the sum of outputs? And it actually turns out that there's a second thing that we need to check, even if we have this, this equality check, or this greater equal check from the inputs and outputs. It turns out that we also need to check that both of the outputs are positive, right? Because otherwise, if I have 5 Bitcoin going in and I have -2 and 7 Bitcoin going out, then the first check goes through, but the second check obviously doesn't go through, and I've now created I have a 7 Bitcoin output, which is a big problem. And the second test, the positive outputs, is actually the more difficult one, and the one that we'll focus on today. The other one is simpler because there's this additive homomorphic property of the commitment scheme. So these confidential transactions were proposed in 2016, as I said, and it is kind of the structure is similar to a Bitcoin transaction. The transaction graph, so who's paying whom, is still publicly available. So we do not hide that. There's other cryptocurrencies like Zcash or Monero that use that have tools kind of for hiding the transaction graph. But the question is, how do we achieve this public verifiability of transaction validity? Well, luckily there's this tool called a zero-knowledge proof of knowledge. So in a zero-knowledge proof of knowledge, you have a prover and a verifier, and the prover Peggy wants to convince the verifier Victor that this commitment that she has is actually a commitment to a positive number. And traditionally, this works through some sort of challenge-response protocol where Victor gets to ask questions to Peggy, and Peggy can only answer these questions if the statement that she's trying to prove is true. If not, then she will be unable, or with high probability, she will be unable to answer these questions. But the answers to the questions, her responses, do not reveal any information about the kind of secret information that she's using to prove the statement. So it doesn't reveal the X or the R in this case. And after this protocol is run, and this can be a multiple round protocol, Victor will be convinced that Peggy knows this value X and that X is positive, but he has still no idea what exactly the value X is. And this is called, concretely, what we're trying to prove here would be called a range proof. So you can prove that X is in a number between, say, 0 and 2 to the 52. And it turns out that we can make this whole thing even non-interactive and publicly verifiable. So there's this kind of common reference string, and Peggy can just write down a proof, and then after the fact, Victor or someone else can check the proof and put it and be convinced that X is in fact positive. And so, for example, this is a proof that you could put on the blockchain attached to your transaction, and everybody is then convinced that your transaction is in fact valid. So how could we make such a proof? Well, at a very high level, what does it mean for a number to be in some range, so between 0 and 2 to the, say, 64 bits? Well, what it means is that I can write it down using 64 bits, right? That a number between 0 and 2 to the 64, I can write down using 64 bits. So one idea is that Peggy will create a commitment for each of the bits and then send over these, n commitments, if we're trying to prove to be that X is between 0 and 2 to the 64 minus 1, actually. And the proof says that each of the committed values, these little committed values, is in fact a commitment to either 0 or 1, and that the big commitment to the whole number is the combination of these bit commitments. So the problem with this range proof, and this is what we could call a linear range proof, and you can base it on these sigma protocols and use the fiat-Shamir heuristic to make it non-interactive, is that they're fairly large. So they're 4 kilobytes, even with some recent optimizations for a 64-bit range proof. And if I try to increase the number of bits in my range, then the proof will grow linearly, right? Because I had to send over even just one commitment per bit in my range. So the nice thing is they don't have a trusted setup, and I'll talk about that in a second. But 4 kilobytes for, this would mean a 4 kilobyte proof being attached to every transaction. That is not really practical today with what blockchains can handle today. So there are shorter proofs, and one of and they're called these pre-processing Snarks. And what they do is there's kind of a trusted setup. So in the beginning, there's some sort of some party that creates these queries, encrypts them, sends them to the prover, and gives the verifier some advice string that will help it to check the answers to these queries. And you can actually create really, really short proofs. And these proofs are a couple, like 200 bytes, irrespective of the complexity of the statement that you're trying to prove. So no matter whether it's a short-range proof, a long-range proof, or an even more complex statement, the size of the proof is only a couple hundred bytes. The problem with this is that, and verification is also fast, which is nice. The problem with this is that, say the person who does this setup is actually malicious and, for example, colludes with the prover or tries to create a proof by himself, then he can create fake proofs. So he can convince you of statements that aren't true. So he could commit to a negative number and prove to you that it is a positive number, and the verifier would be fooled. Why is this a problem? Why are these trusted setups a problem, especially in cryptocurrencies? Well, the problem is that what does it mean to create a fake proof? Well, if the subverted prover of the setup is subverted, then this is undetectable. There's no way to really test for it. And B, then you can create these transactions which have, say, negative amounts in them. And what that really means is that I can create money out of thin air. It is inflation, and it is even undetectable inflation, because now all the amounts are being hidden, right? It's not like in Bitcoin where all the amounts are public and you can check how much total money there is. If the trusted setup is being subverted, then no one knows how much money there is, and there's really, it's undetectable inflation, and an attacker could really extract a lot of money from the system. So it's a very bad situation. And the problem is that even if you don't have a subverted setup, even the fear of this undetectable inflation is dangerous. So for example, Zcash uses these Snarks, and there's people going around saying, it's not secure, the setup is subverted, which they did a very good job at trying to prevent that, but there's really nothing more that you can say. There's no proof that you can give to people to say, no, the setup was done correctly. And this fear can lower, for example, the price of the cryptocurrency and the value of it and the willingness of people to use it. So the way to alleviate this is usually through this kind of distributed setup and so-called multi-party computation. And this is difficult, but Zcash actually did that and is doing that but it's, this, you can read up on it on the Zcash ceremony. There's a great podcast on it, I think by Planet Money or something. And it's, they had to do a lot of work to do this, and it's kind of annoying, and you still don't solve all the problems. And also, every time you add some new functionality, it means that you have a new setup, right? Every time you change even the slightest thing, you would have to redo the setup. So they have to actually redo the setup right now. So that, again, is a problem. So for example, there's Hawk, which is, is kind of a smart contract, confidential smart contract, a private smart contract, a proposal for that, a paper. And what they had is that there's a different trusted setup for every single smart contract, and that clearly doesn't seem feasible. So with that in mind, we were looking for other proof systems that could help, that did not have this trusted setup, but still could be used for these range proofs. So there's this paper by Jonathan Boodle and a group at University College London, which are these log size proofs for arithmetic circuit. So this is a proof protocol, again, for arithmetic circuit, which means for kind of arbitrary computation. And the nice thing is that the proofs are only logarithmic in the size of the computation. So asymptotically, this seemed great, and it also doesn't have a trusted setup and only relies on the discrete log assumption. The problem was that in practice, if you actually wanted to do a range proof, you would have to do a proof that, this value, you would have to implement the commitment function, which is a multi-exponentiation, within the circuit, and things get rather expensive, and in practice, it would not have been much better than the linear protocol that was out there, especially in size, and probably a lot worse in terms of proving and verification time. But we looked at their protocol and changed it and improved it such that it would work better for these range proofs and also works better in general. And this is how we came up with bulletproofs, which allows you now to do proofs on committed values. And what that means is that I can do a proof on something that is within the commitment. I don't have to implement the commitment function or the opening function of the commitment within the arithmetic circuit. So, and also we reduce the proof size by a factor of 3, which means that now you only have to give 2 log 2 of n elements for a range proof, and these improvements also transfer over to arbitrary arithmetic circuits, which means when I say arithmetic circuits, I mean that I can prove to you that I know some secret inputs to a circuit or a function such that the function evaluates to, say, 1. Okay? And I don't have to give you what these values are, but I can convince you that I know these secret values. So you can implement more complex functionalities with this. So let's see what this kind of this improvement to like 2 log n elements, what does this mean in practice? Well, for a single range proof, this means that our proofs are 670 bytes versus the previous range proof, which was 4 kilobytes. And Snarks are, 188 bytes, so they clearly knocked the ball out of the park, but they have the problem with the trusted setup. The nice thing is that, a transaction, as I depicted it earlier, usually has multiple outputs. So say it has 2 outputs, and I want to prove to you that both of these outputs are positive, which is the usual situation. Well, it turns out because we have this logarithmic scaling, we can just create one bulletproof for both of these outputs. And what that means is that suddenly now both of these proofs together are just 736 bytes. So we just added 64 bytes to double the number of proofs that we're doing, whereas the previous proof would scale linearly, so it would be 8 kilobytes. And this goes on, if I have 10 proofs, it's 928 bytes versus almost 40,000 bytes. So the more outputs, or the larger the statement is that you're trying to prove, the larger the savings are that bulletproofs has versus these traditional proofs. So when would we ask ourselves, well, when would these transactions ever have that many outputs, right? Like, you might send some Bitcoin to your whole family for Christmas, but usually, right, like you only have 2 outputs. So, but there's multiple people at the same time that are trying to do a transaction and trying to create a bulletproof. So we looked at the situation where there's multiple provers. Each of them have a commitment, right? Each of them want to send some money, and they want to create a single proof without revealing the secrets to each other, that all of their commitments commit to, say, positive numbers, or they want to prove something about these commitments. But concretely, we cared about range proofs. And, well, how can they create one proof? Well, a trivial solution is obviously they can concatenate their proofs, but we would want something that is something where the proof is small. So the generic way to do this is a multi-party computation, but it turns out that we can create, or the prover is extremely structured, so we can create this custom multi-party computation which allows these provers to kind of create one proof together instead of having multiple proofs. And this works whenever kind of each of them wants to prove a separate statement, and then the overall statement is just a conjunction of all of their statements. So it's, prover 1 wants to say my value is in some range, and then prover 2 wants to say my value is in another range, and prover 3 wants to prove something completely different, but it's just an AND between these 3 things. So the nice thing is that we can do this in a logarithmic number of rounds, so there has to be some communication, and with a logarithmic amount of communication, or there's a different protocol which just has 3 rounds but has linear communication, so more communication. So this is a trade-off kind of that we provide, and there's multiple levels in between that. So the nice thing is that this allows us, there's already this protocol for, which is called, I think, well, I have it on the next slide, what it's called, but there's this protocol for combining transactions, where multiple users can combine transactions. And the traditional reason why this was used is because people wanted to hide who they're sending money to, right? So you get some added anonymity from that. But now with confidential transactions and with bulletproofs, it actually makes the average size, or it makes the size of the proof, and by that the transaction fees, which scale linearly in the size of the transaction, it makes it cheaper. So there's even economic incentives to combine your transactions into one transaction that is smaller. So what are the what are the results of this? How can bulletproof help for confidential transaction, or this is also this new blockchain format called Mimblewimble? Well, as I said, it's 670 bytes instead of 4 kilobytes per range proof in a 64-bit range. But again, then this aggregation really helps to make this gap a lot bigger. So for 16 range proofs, it's 930 bytes versus 61 kilobytes. And doubling the precision would only add 64 bytes, right? Again, this is just this logarithmic scaling. And concretely, if kind of the structure of transaction didn't change, which we would assume it would because there's new incentives, even then, if you just applied the old confidential transactions to Bitcoin, your UTXO set would be 160 gigabytes, and now with bulletproofs, it would be 17 gigabytes. And this is the protocol that I was talking about was called CoinJoin. That was the name that I couldn't think of. So it has this kind of built-in simple CoinJoin protocol for combining transactions into a single one. We also looked at whether, so the protocol is susceptible to kind of quantum attacks, and we looked at things that, versus it's susceptible to attacks by a quantum computer. And we looked at things that perhaps, where a quantum computer could only break the hiding property of the proof, so the zero knowledge property of the proof, but not the actual so-called soundness. The problem is this, so the idea is that an attacker could reveal or see how much money everybody is spending, so break the privacy, but not print new money. It turns out that because we're using compression, so it turns out because we want our proofs to be actually smaller than the statement that we're proving, this is, it's impossible to get this unconditional soundness. So as I said, bulletproofs also works for these arbitrary statements. So for example, you could use it on Zcash, and the proof size would be 1.7 kilobytes, but actually Zcash is improving kind of their circuit, and that would help bulletproofs a lot, so it would be 1.3 kilobytes. There's a reason why Zcash can probably not switch to bulletproof, which is that the verification time, the proof size scales logarithmic in the size of the proof, but the verification time is still linear. So the more complex, if I'm trying to prove to you a statement that is twice as complex, verifying it will take roughly twice as long. So this is an overview over kind of different proof systems, and the short takeaway from this is that there's multiple, the space is really developing. There's multiple different proof systems out there. Each of them has different benefits, and it really depends on the application which one is the best one to use. So, Snarks are extremely efficient in terms of verifier time and proof size, but they have this trusted setup. And the bulletproofs are short, but the verifier takes linear time, so this doesn't work for if the statement you're trying to prove is too complex. So if you have to really think about your application when there's no clear winner out there, so you have to do some thinking, and it's really application specific of what the best tool is. I just want to touch on one or maybe two other things where bulletproofs can also help. So we had this protocol that we developed in 2015, which allowed Bitcoin exchanges to prove that they're solvent, so that they have enough money for paying out all their customers without revealing any information. So without revealing how much money they have in total, or what their Bitcoin addresses are, or any of these information. So it's kind of a zero-knowledge proof for solvency. And with bulletproofs, this would dramatically reduce the size of the proof from 18 gigabytes to a couple megabytes. Another application outside the realm of blockchains is something called a verifiable shuffle. So this is used in so-called mixnets, where each sender, there's a couple senders, each of them has an email, and there's receivers, and you want to somehow have this interactive protocol which hides which message is going to whom. And one core component of this is you need to produce these zero-knowledge proofs that the inputs and outputs, or that n encrypted inputs and n encrypted outputs are the same. And it turns out that with bulletproofs, it's the first logarithmic size verifiable shuffle without a trusted setup. So this proving that the inputs and outputs are the same is called a verifiable shuffle, right? I shuffle the values and I can prove to you that I did it correctly. And with bulletproofs, we can do this very efficiently. So we also implemented this, or let's say Andrew and Peter did an amazing job at implementing this into the Bitcoin cryptographic library with, the prover is constant time, so there's no timing attacks there, and the verifier is extremely fast. And I know that there's multiple other implementations in progress or already out there. And one of the main things that we did when implementing is kind of boiling down this very complex verification protocol to this one simple big multi-exponentiation, which is just this check that you see here on the right. So if I want to check a proof, I just kind of have to do this. It almost boils down, I'm hiding some details here, to this one check. So the reason why this is interesting is because multi-exponentiation is, to some degree, it's sublinear. So it scales with n over log n, and this actually gives us some benefits. And it turns out that for small circuits, verifying, so for example, for range proofs, verifying a bulletproof is even faster than verifying a snark. The other thing that this multi-exponentiation gives us is that, say I have two bulletproofs, okay? And then I have these two big multi-exponentiations that I need to verify, where only the exponents are different, or most of the generators, kind of the things at the bottom, are the same, but the exponents are different. Well, it turns out that there's this batch verification technique that was originally designed for signatures, but it also applies here, where you can you just combine these equations by raising the first one to a random scalar alpha and then adding them together. And what this means is that I need to do a couple more scalar operations, but I still only need to do the same number of exponentiations. And if you've ever implemented cryptography, it turns out that these exponentiations are a lot more expensive than the scalar operations. So in effect, what this does is that verifying the first proof this is I think for a 64-bit range proof, is 6.2 milliseconds, and verifying the second one is only 550 microseconds. So a factor of 10 times less. And if you're, for example, a miner and want to verify a whole block of transactions, your amortized cost is really closer to the 550 microseconds. So yeah, thank you very much. The website where you can find the paper and links to the implementations is crypto.stanford.edu/bulletproofs. Thank you very much.
Any questions? So can you say a bit about where this is going to be used?
Oh yeah, so Monero, which is I think the 10th largest cryptocurrency, actually they announced that they will implement this because they have, they've been struggling with their transaction sizes because they use the traditional confidential transactions, and so they will actually implement this. And I think their goal is by the end of the year that bulletproofs will secure this multi-billion-dollar cryptocurrency, which is, it's in some ways it's very cool, and in other ways it's pretty insane, that like research that is, no, it's insanely cool that, yeah, like this, how fast, in this space, I think research is getting deployed into practice. I mean, I think you said at some point, like usually it takes 7 or 17 years or something for crypto to be deployed, and
maybe that's worth saying. 17 years because of you need for patents to expire.
Ah, okay.
17 years in the open and the clear.
Yes, of course. There's no patent. The library is open source. You can use it. I think it's very probably. I don't know what the license is, but something permissive for businesses. So yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thanks.
Oh, sorry.